So it was 2002 and I wandered out of the cinema having just seen this film. How many people have seen Minority Report or remember this movie? Well, I often say Tom Cruise in this movie completely changed my life. And I remember coming out of the cinema and actually staring up at the sky and thinking, is that really the future? You know, this was long before we started talking about ad blocking. This was long before we had mobile devices in our hands every day. But this idea that we would lose any kind of personal agency, that any time that we were walking between the office and getting our car or jumping on the train, that we would just be constantly inundated with information, advertising, this kind of assault to our privacy and our personal space. So, how did I get here today? Where did this all begin? And if I stop and think about it, it was really that moment outside of the cinema. I remember thinking, someone needs to do something about this future so that you and I have some sense of agency. I didn't think that it would be me. It was one of those kind of crazy thoughts in a moment where you think, I don't really like where that is going, and I love science fiction, but I didn't think for a moment that it would be part of my own life story. But it wouldn't go away. This idea was really, really bugging me, and around the end of 2011, I started looking at what was happening around personal data and digital identity. And I have to say, I really started with the European Union and a lot of things that the World Economic Forum were writing at the time. I started to see the value of personal data on the balance sheets of companies. This issue of personal identity was becoming increasingly in the spotlight. And what I started to think was our data is really more like our DNA. And there are things about our physicality, our physical being, that we just expect to be in control of. Or if we close a door, we expect somebody to knock on that door before we decide to open it. But what I was starting to see was that in the digital world, we were kind of losing that moment between the knock and the door being opened. And so in early 2012, still without really any idea that I was going to change my whole life direction, I penned this manifesto and be very happy to share with it. And the core idea was that up until now, the power derived from collecting information and using information really resided with social networks and governments. And what if you and I had that same power? What would it be like if we could use the data and information that is about ourselves to make better decisions about our health, better decisions about our children, better decisions about our work, better decisions about the way we use our time, better decisions about the way we learn? And so from that question came this idea that really every one of us on the planet, if we're moving towards this information age, every one of us should have the right to get equity and value for the information we share. And that doesn't mean selling that information. Value comes in many different ways, and there's some of the things that I would love to explore with you over the course of this next hour. So I wrote this manifesto. Great. Writing a manifesto doesn't mean you've started a company. I'm still working full-time in consulting. I have only the money that I'm earning. And so this idea of how does an idea actually become either some type of movement or a company comes back to the reality of, well, is there a business model? Is there a new way of thinking about this? And I was lucky at the time to meet a couple of guys that are actually, still part of our team, brilliant architect and our head of engineering. And we got into a room and we started to imagine what the future might look like. And one of the documents we took into the room was the Facebook IPO document. So it was 2012, and they were about to list on the stock exchange in the United States. And I said to the guys, let's go to the risks, because anyone in doing an IPO has a responsibility to signal to the market the things that may undermine the value of the stock. And what are the things that they are being transparent about? And there were 4 things that jumped out. The first was regulation. What if what they were intending to do from a business model point of view was subject to some type of regulation? The second thing was privacy. What if the exponential rate of growth with Facebook, what if people started to become a bit concerned about their privacy? The third thing was value. What if customers actually understood the value and power of their information? And the fourth thing was, in 2012, was the move from largely a desktop application to a mobile application, and the idea that advertising would need to fit into a much smaller screen format and therefore grab the attention. And we said, okay, let's just fast forward that all of those 4 things happen. There is some regulation. People become aware of privacy. People become aware of the value of their data. And let's say that they architect the platform in a way that something like this might happen. What would it look like if all of a sudden this great new social connector actually became something that really was betraying people at a very fundamental level in terms of their trust? And so fast forward from there, what we've seen just in the last 6 months, we don't have to go very far to look at the numbers of issues that are in the media every single day around our personal data, our information, the way that we are targeted, the way that information is collected. We see that ad blocking is now running at around 615 million installations, and I understand that Apple is going to make that just a simple plug-in feature in their next iOS. And then we start to see that data breaches, we're counting these now in the tens of millions, whether or not you're looking at Equifax. And if we look at just the tip of the iceberg with Cambridge Analytica, and I say the tip of the iceberg because, as we've seen in the press the last few weeks, is that the type of data handling that was associated with this actually is going on with lots of companies. I read of a company yesterday that was offering medical advice to young mothers through their pregnancy and then using that data to retarget around access to health services. So we're at this point right now where we have this paradox. We are questioning who can we trust and can we trust and why should we trust? And at the same time, we're really busy and we want things to be personalised. We want to be recognised. We want to be recognised for our loyalty. We don't want to be filling out the same forms over and over and over. We don't want to be giving the same information over. But if the cost of doing that is actually giving up some personal agency, this creates quite a paradox. And what I think this has done is it's really led us to the edge of either an evolution or a digital revolution. And I think what excites me about being here today and what excites me about the potential for the European single market is I really think that this is absolutely a time in history. This is a pivotal point where Europe has an opportunity to decide the type of society that it wants to be and lead in the way that we collect and use information. But we know in order that to happen, there needs to be some incentives for this kind of change. And we understand the way the world works, that it's often economic incentives. So this was a report that was done by the World Economic Forum and BCG back in 2012. And it was one of the reports that had me believe very strongly that there was underlying a better commercial model, a fairer commercial model. And the model at that time was that the single digital market in Europe for personal data was valued at approximately €1 trillion, with the opportunity for 670 billion of that to flow back into the hands of European citizens in some form of value if trust and transparency was able to be achieved. If we look at the United States, the cost of bad data is running at the moment at around 3 trillion. And as I start to look at my goddaughter and her generation, she's 11, and I speak to her friends, I speak to my nephew and my niece, The school that they attend is encouraging them constantly. Don't use real information online. Don't use your real name. Don't use your real address. Don't use your real telephone number. And so what we're doing is we have a whole digital generation that recognise that it's very important to mask who they really are from the information that they're giving. And then the tiny little population that I come from in Australia, just 24 million people, our digital identity market is alone valued at over $11 billion for a very small population. But the problem is trust and transparency. And this is what's sitting between right now the opportunity to unlock this new value. And I believe what we need is a new social contract. In internet terms and social networking terms, we're kind of digital teenagers. And there were many things about Susan's presentation this morning that I found inspiring and just so clarifying in terms of where we find ourselves right now at this point in history. And one of those things is we're still developing the cognitive skills to understand what this super hyper-connected digital teenage world is like. We're kind of digital teenagers. We've been at this for less than 2 decades. And so one of the things that we did, which is natural, we raced towards all the fun things, we connected everyone on the planet, and we didn't really stop to sit back and say, well, what does that mean for society? What's the contract that we're creating with each other, with our families, with our employees, with our friends? And so I think what we find ourselves right now is as kind of this bend in the road, without necessarily saying that one way is better than the other, because technology is benign, it's neutral. Technology can be used for good, technology can be used for evil. So it's really our choice. And so one of those paths could lead to a renaissance, an incredible flourishing digital time in life, where just like the Renaissance in terms of art and literature and architecture, we may find ourselves where we're able to muster things like artificial intelligence and the way we learn and the way we connect to create an amazing society. Or we could find ourselves actually moving backwards at an exponential pace into what I see is quite an Orwellian digital feudalism, where without realizing it, by constantly agreeing to terms and conditions that we don't understand, we actually find ourselves back in the equivalent of a time in history where we have no personal agency. So how did we get here? And how did we get here so quickly? So here's kind of where it starts and where it's speeding up. It starts often with agreeing to download an app, install something, click I agree, terms and conditions that we don't read. And we don't actually understand because we haven't up until now either had the laws or the infrastructure or the regulation or even the understanding to understand what it means when we say I agree. The average digital birth for an American child is around 6 weeks. And by 6 weeks, there's enough information and there are enough photographs out there. Here's mum and dad. Here's what it looks like on Facebook. Here's the date of birth. Here's the baby's name for companies to start modeling out life expectancy, access to insurance, the academic or socioeconomic environment of the parents, likelihood for a whole range of things, from access to services over life. And this is not something that the average mum and dad are thinking about when they share a picture of their newborn baby and share with the world when she was born and how old and at what time and on what day and in what place with her full name with a big smile. And so fast forward now to what we're starting to see in the education system. And there was a mother, a lawyer in the United States who did an amazing job against the will of all the other parents around an educational tool, I think it was called In Bloom, which was actually, all the parents had agreed for this system to go into the school, was actually tracking everything that the children did when they turned up at work, their academic records, their health, whether or not there were family issues, and reserved the right to sell that information to third parties. And she was a lawyer, and she stepped in New York State, and she read the terms and conditions, and she raised this with other parents at the school. And they were saying, what's the problem? Look at all the benefits. Look at how much easier it is. The teachers are saying it's simpler to mark tasks than it is for them to take physical things and have to take them home. And so we have this tension all the time between convenience and privacy. Fast forward to wearables, the things that we put on our skin every day. Fast forward to starting to shop online. And then all of a sudden, what's happened is we have become that product. And we've done this in tiny little incremental steps. It's not like somebody said, sign here, and these are all of the things in your life that you will sign away. We do this in tiny little ways every day without realizing. And one of the problems that we have right now when we start to think about that choice is even speaking to teenagers that understand that they're in the grip of wanting to be connected to their device, we're starting to see the academic research, and this is something that was covered incredibly well this morning, but we've got a recent study where 50% of the teenagers said that they actually can see and feel in themselves that they're addicted to their devices. We also have this rise in social isolation, a link between depression and activity on social media. And one of the things that really concerns me in talking to my goddaughter and my niece is some of the things that are going on in terms of bullying in such a way that it's so private, it's happening, it's that last little message before they go to bed. And that's the last thing they're thinking about, that it's not necessarily something that's being discussed at the family table. Jaron Lanier, who is a great inspiration to me, published a new book just recently, and in an article that ran in the Financial Times on the weekend, he described the current way that we're tracking society from a social point of view as pervasive surveillance and constant subtle manipulation that is unethical, cruel, dangerous, and inhuman. So, how did we get here? Where does it start? Well, there are many positive things to the next few slides that I want to share with you, but we need to be thinking about the architecture of how we do these things. So, we issue an identity as a citizen. We then think that it might be convenient to connect that in some way to our role as a student, or we may want to reuse it as a patient. Actually, there are some aspects of that would make checking out online or walking into a store much easier. So let's use it as a customer. Oh, actually, that would be helpful for faster onboarding as an employee. And why not use that in some way for when we're traveling? And what we've had up until now is the ability to keep a lot of those attributes separate and contextual and in a silo. The things that your employer may ask or an airline may ask make sense in the context of what you're doing. Going to work, applying for a job, responsibility in your role, boarding an aeroplane, crossing a border. But the problem that we have right now with the way that we have architected our digital world is that this is what happens. Every day, all of these attributes are being connected, and this story about ourselves is becoming richer and richer and richer. And the value of that, the power of that, is not something that we have the mechanisms right now to put back into our own hands. Or maybe. What I'd like to talk about for a few minutes is 3 shifts that actually might save us. And I think one of the amazing things about Europe right now is that there is an opportunity for Europe to spearhead this. So that first shift is starting to secure new digital rights. What we understand is if there is going to be any change at all, we need to have some kind of protection. We need to have some sort of rights. In the same way that we have physical rights, we need to have digital rights. And so the things that are starting to emerge that are European-led are around GDPR, our right to consent, our right to transparency, open banking, the right to get your transaction data and be able to use that to make better financial decisions. We have e-privacy, and we have the Payment Services Directory that is starting to look at the fees, the hidden costs associated with the products and decisions that we're making every day, and give us that information to make that to make those decisions much more transparent. But contrast that with the United States and the current administration. And in the first year of this new administration, many of the privacy rights and the data protection capabilities that the previous administration had spent 6 years, 8 years championing and getting to the place in regulation disappeared very quickly. Until a week ago, when California decided that California was going to act like a little mini European state, and it was going to put into law very, very quickly, in fact, so quickly, within a week, that we now have some of the tech giants that are petitioning at a federal level to say it happened too soon, and they want the right to go back and revise this before it comes into application in 2020. So even within a country, we have this tension around whether or not people should have digital rights. Australia, where I'm from, our productivity commissioner started to work with our treasurer last year to look at the value of personal data and look at the digital rights for Australian citizens. Very small population compared to Europe. And one of the things that's interesting around the first report is it actually went beyond GDPR. And one of the things that it called out was this idea that actually, not only do we have this comprehensive right to access and control our data, but actually it might be an asset. An asset in the same way that our car is an asset in the same way that our stock portfolio is an asset. And when you start to think about it at the level of an asset, everything changes. Because where we find ourselves right now is that actually money is just technology. We're at a place now where everything is virtual. It's not like there is actually gold held in the Reserve Bank of England anymore or at Fort Knox. There isn't some physical thing that underpins our monetary system. It's based on trust. It's based on confidence. It's based on the way that we can model things out. It's based on data. It's based on whether or not there are strong trade relationships in place between countries. And as we start to look at what's happening in the crypto space and alternative currencies, we have this tension now between a sovereign currency that is issued and alternate currencies that are arising out of networks of people saying, well, we would like a peer-to-peer relationship rather than an intermediary relationship. And I think the interesting thing, if you start to think that data is an asset or data is money, and you start to think of money as technology, and we start to think about the future, this is from Dave Birch's book that he recently published, Before Babylon and Beyond Bitcoin, where he says that money, or our confidence in a form of money, may actually be a claim against a future production of goods or the delivery of a service. And what do you need to be able to model those things out? You need data. So if we think about what the Australian government included in their report, that this idea that data might be an asset, and that assets generate value, and that the person that controls that asset derives that value. Now, each of us, if we have cash in our wallet or in our bag, we don't actually own that cash, but we have the right, while ever it's in our possession, to derive the value of that. We decide how we want to apply that, who we want to give it to, how we want to use it. So when you start to think about data in the same way, it's not necessarily about ownership even, it's about this idea, the right to control it. We also know that markets form by trading value, and the confidence of the market is the confidence in the value that is there. And therefore, market efficiencies unlock new value. And I think that is one of the opportunities that Europe has with a single digital market, is if the architecture for this is right, then exponential value can be unlocked. But what will it take to actually unlock this value? Which takes us to the second shift. It's this realization now that each of us are actually part of the value chain. Technology has come to a point where we are able to participate in the way that governments have participated with each other, corporations have participated with each other. So this isn't just about privacy, which is critical. Our rights of, it's actually, from a European point of view, it's a fundamental human right. But this is also about power. This is about starting to think about a future where the form of money and the form of currency may be very different to what we have in our pockets, and may be very difficult for us to extract that if we don't take hold of these rights right now and understand. So if there's this new asset class out there, and it's going to be controlled by, the interesting thing about this image is we can't see this person. And in some ways, this ability for us to start thinking with technology a way to mask the person until the person feels they are ready to declare who they are is a really critical design principle. Because one of the things that we need to be able to do is see what the circumstances are before we decide to share information, and understand whether or not the value of sharing that is equal to that trade-off. And what we know is right now that that value is derived by whoever can identify that person, that object, and use that information in that context. We also have this situation right now where everything is getting smaller, faster, on the body, in the body. I spoke at CES last year in Las Vegas, and one of the people that spoke before me was talking about this little nano robot technology, which you could swallow, and if you have a heart condition, it could actually send a message to you like an SMS about 20 minutes ahead of having a heart attack. So you imagine you're busy at work, you're a little stressed, you get a message, heart attack in the next 15 to 20 minutes. Excuse me, I just need to leave the room. I'll be back as soon as I can get this seen to. So if we're talking about technology that's on our body, in our body, if we're talking about things that are that close to our skin, then we're really talking about a digital evolution that is like a second skin. It's really us. Value chains are developing at such a rapid exponential space that it's not just people, but it's people and things. It's the thermostat in our home. It's the smart dashboard in our car. It's the wearable that we're running with. It's the geolocation in our phone. And so what we find from a value chain point of view is that we've moved from this idea as customers or recipients of a service. We're no longer right at the end of the value chain. It's not that there is this whole process of things that happens and then we're there. What we've started to see is that the digital world allows us to be at the center of those things. And we're at the center of those things because of the power that we have to do things like question the employment practices of the manufacturer, or order something online and totally customize it, or decide where it is that we're going to have it shipped, or this phygital experience where we may go in and touch and feel and choose something from a physical point of view, but only ever interact with that company in a digital way. And so when we start to think about ourselves in the center of this shift towards personalization, this shift towards participation, then what we start to see is the underlying possibility is that power is shifting to you and I. And in fact, for smart organizations, for smart governments, you and I are the platform. And finding a way to interact with us in a transparent and trusted way would unlock what we call the API of me. And this was the mission that I set out with our company in 2012 to work out how it is that we could start to turn some of these data practices into something as simple as the way we use cash in our pocket every day. How could we start to have data in our pocket in a way that we could have more autonomy in life? Which brings us to the third shift: new currency, new business models. So we know that one of the challenges right now, and part of the reason why GDPR and the data protection regulation and privacy, e-privacy has emerged, is in some ways to challenge these incumbent, entrenched business models that we've arrived with in a relatively short period of time, which is the monetization of the information that is collected often without any transparency. We also know that there is tension right now from a business model point of view between surveillance and distrust, as we've seen with Cambridge Analytica, we've seen with Facebook. I think it was Monday they received a £500,000 fine for not being responsible to follow up with Cambridge Analytica and make sure the information was deleted when they were told that it was. And then a colleague of mine sent me a message saying that equates to about 7 minutes of revenue for Facebook. So it's not really an incentive to change in some way. So we're at this point of tension around whether or not we could start to prove that consent and trust can actually create better models. So here we are back at that fork in the road again. And the choice that we have, certainly in the digital space, between two business models that are becoming more evident and more polarized. So the first are for organizations that create some type of product or service for people. Yes, they collect data. Yes, they generate data. But the primary relationship is between either a beautiful object or an essential service that you and I can access. The other model is being able to track what we do in the provision of a product or service as a means of creating a business. And a great example of this is Airbnb, that doesn't own any hotels. Obviously, Facebook as a publisher that doesn't employ any journalists. So we have many, or Uber, that actually doesn't own any taxis. So we have these services where by creating this level of convenience, you can have the secondary product, which is the core business model. We also have some of the tech giants now publicly coming out and starting to say where they fit. Tim Cook has been very, very direct around Apple's position on privacy. And Microsoft just recently announced about 6 weeks ago that they would start to develop a decentralized identity stack so that people could actually use their technology stack to develop their own self-sovereign identity. What we also see is Facebook constantly in the news, but Google and Amazon keeping their heads down and really separating out from the voice of these two different business models. And what we see is that Amazon, 2 weeks ago, I was in the US, and Amazon acquired, I think, the largest American online pharmacy, drugstore, which will be now part of their overall offering. And my first question was, what does that look like if Amazon knows the medication we're taking? What does that look like? How does that information get mashed up with the sort of products that you're buying? What if you have high blood pressure and you've just booked something online that creates some tension? Where does that information go? In researching for the talk today, I went back to one of my favorite clips, and in fact, this was a beacon on the hill for me in creating Meeco. So this was, and I would encourage you, it's just a 3-minute YouTube clip. It was in 2010, which seems like a very long time ago now. And Mark Zuckerberg was in the audience, and it was at the end of, I think, Tech Disrupt or something. It was very close to the end of Steve Jobs' life. And the moderator said, look, I want to tack an extra question on. I want to talk about privacy. And he actually turned to a very young Mark Zuckerberg and said, sorry, Mark. And so even in 2010, there was tension between the two models. And I would encourage you to look at the video. But the interesting thing that Steve Jobs was saying at the time was that they were very, very clear about their business model. And when it came to privacy, it was about asking customers every day what you wanted to do with their data. And the interesting thing about this is it was just before the cloud move, and there's been obviously criticism since then around whether or not Apple has stayed completely aligned to the ethos that Steve was sharing that day. But one of the things that he was saying is we want to architect these walled gardens so that if your application is accessing location, we want to make sure we're serving up a notice to ask you as the user if that's something you want and not rely on who's developing the app for that. So what we realise is that big data, joining data, has led to lots of convenience. And one of the things that big data has done really well is it's helped get a more accurate modelling around the kinds of things we do and collect data real time. But I think that there are two things that you and I have that actually create much more value in the data and information, and that's context and intention. You know, recently I searched online for a gift for my brother-in-law, and it was something that he wanted for his boat. I am never, ever going to buy that object again unless it falls off the side of the boat and he asks me to buy it again. But we all know this story. We all know that the minute you search for something, it's assumed that that's something that you want, that you're interested in, and then that search follows us around and around. And if we start to think about the potential for a new model, this idea of context, no, I'm not doing this for me. I'm never going to do this again. I'm doing this for a once-off gift. Or intention. I'm intending to do this for my brother-in-law, for my partner, for my employee, whatever that case may be, that actually makes the data far more valuable. So if we can find a way to get directly into the value chain, we may find that we can actually help service providers move from what at the moment feels incredibly creepy to something that's actually quite cool. If we're participants in the way that that information is collected, participants in the way that it is used, then what we can start to do is think differently about how we contextualize information, how we create personas that are relevant for our work life, for our travel life, and how we may be able to augment that information to actually create a richer experience. So the question right now with business models is, what are the board discussions that are going on? What are the discussions around the trajectory? And why is that important to each of you at Fabasoft and what you've achieved? Here you are celebrating 30 years and pioneering in cloud and security. I don't think there's ever been a more important time to understand that the decisions that are made in a board that then translate to the type of technology actually drive society. So we have this opportunity right now with this evolution or this revolution to create significant new economic and societal value. But that isn't going to happen unless we actually start to think about what is the intended consequence of the technology that we use? What is the intended consequence of a single digital market? What is the intended consequence of the convenience of portable identity? And when I talk about this often around the world, whether or not it's about digital rights, what I hear is, well, you don't have to worry about that, Katryna, because AI and the blockchain is going to solve it. And while that's true, I think in some ways, I don't think it's going to solve everything. But one of the things that I do think that we can achieve through both of these emerging technologies, and the thing that excites me the most with what's happening around blockchain and distributed ledger, is that it's forcing us to have this sense of transparency in society. It's forcing us to say, well, you might have information in a database there, but I actually want to see what happens with that information. I want to see this chain of provenance. And I want to go on the record, absolutely, I do not believe we should be putting any personally identified information on a blockchain. But the idea of being able to record provenance or have some record for us to be able to use information in a way where we cut down on the way that it's duplicated, I think has some amazing applications. And when it comes to artificial intelligence, I've been working with IEEE for the last year on looking at how personal data is used in the development of artificial autonomous systems, and everything from weapons to sex toys to education, and the things that we've been really grappling with is this question always around ethics and principles. We keep coming back and saying AI is benign. It's just code. It's just pattern. It's just pattern in and pattern out. The question we have to be asking before the code is, what do we want that pattern to look like? And I think one of the things that we need to be thinking about as a room full of professionals that are actually responsible for the foundations of this is, how do we get to building systems where we are looking at minimal collection for maximum value? How do we get back to this binary state of over 18 rather than date of birth, eligible for this service cross-border rather than all of this information about somebody's medical history? How do we get to this point where we can start to build confidence into zero knowledge proofs? How do we start to reorganize our government, our banks, our financial institutions, our telcos, trusted providers to verify information at the source and then wrap a binary yes or no around that so that we can speed up this digital market? How do we get technology designed in such a way that we are part of saying yes to our identity and yes to the consent to the use of our personal data? And the great news is GDPR is a fantastic start, but I'm sure, as Simon and your colleagues are finding every day, there are so many companies that have really just turned this into cookie policy 2.0. In order for you to keep doing this, I need your consent. And I'm even questioning whether consent is the right word or whether or not it's consequence. Show me the consequence of me saying yes. And consequence can be positive, consequence can be neutral, and consequence can be negative. So we have to find a way of actually automating this so that it reflects our choices, our values, our principles, so that it's not creating this overload for us every day. And if we can do that from a technology point of view, we can then have service providers actually bring the logic and the algorithms and the processing into contracts on our data, around our identity, around us as a little centralized processing unit. And imagine that, every single one of us as a distributed network with the ability to bring that powerful information processing to each of us on the edge and derive some value out of that. So one of the things that we're very focused on in Meeco is this idea that we have to stop monetizing the data and we have to enable new services. We have to find smart ways of using that information. And one of the things that we imagine is this trusted data ecosystem, which we think there is a great opportunity to happen here in Europe. This idea that with the digital rights of GDPR, the right of access, the right of consent, what we have on this side is this whole world of data and information that you and I have under our control, or should have under our control. The things we wear, our education records, our medical records, our employee records, our fingerprint, our biometrics, our smart home, our smart car, the people we're connected to. Imagine if we could find a way to harness that information with the idea of our identity or a persona and strong architectural means in the centre to protect us, to bring that into a vibrant ecosystem, a trusted data ecosystem, where there was transparency around the information that was being used and how it's being used. There's also talk, there are a few movements around the idea that the way we organise the collection of information could enable either a universal basic income, or there is a book that came out a couple of months ago called Radical Markets, and Jaron Lanier is one of the co-authors of the white paper that preceded that, with this idea that right now, each of us are tiny little worker bees in the Amazon factory, in the Facebook factory. And there's this growing movement, and there's quite a lot happening in the Netherlands right now around data as labour. This idea that every day we toil as if we were in a little data factory creating this value and it's being transferred. And what would that look like if that value was transferred back to us? The universal basic income is being tested at the moment in Finland, in Hawaii, and in Canada. And there is a lot of tension around what this might mean for society, but some of the early studies actually show that the search for meaning and the idea of not living on the breadline, the idea of having some sense of freedom actually means people don't sit around in coffee shops all day doing nothing. It actually leads to people feeling some sense of empowerment to start asking questions about what it is they may like to do with their life. And I'm not for or against any of these things right now. I think it's early and we're just starting to learn what a new knowledge-based society might look like. But one of the interesting things is, what if there's actually enough right now to distribute that value and kickstart this new market? So what does that mean for each of us, for you and I, on this 30th anniversary? I know, and I mentioned this to Helmut very briefly last night, I think when you wake up and decide to found a company, it takes a little bit of madness and a little bit of naivety, because if you really knew what you would have to do, I don't think anyone would set out to do it. And then it takes finding great partners, an amazing team, and weathering the storms, and moving through and being resilient. And one of the things that I think it also means for each of you, and for me, for us in the room, is we have another layer of responsibility as technologists, more so than we've ever had before. Because we're actually out there every day designing the foundation. And I would like to reframe what you do and start to think about yourselves as guardians of the cloud. You know, we've found the way to connect all this information and we've seen the efficiencies of it. But we find ourselves right now at this moment of time where we really need to think about how we move forward. And that's not just because of GDPR. That's not just because the US is treating data very differently. That's not just because Australia may borrow some of it, or China has implemented the China game, which would allow citizens to gain economic advantage, travel advantage, access to cash by spying on other citizens and reporting and collecting data. So we have these differences of cultural views even around information. And I think what that means for each of us is we need to understand more than ever before we write a line of code, what's the strategy? What's the business model? What's the jurisdiction? What is the best place to put this cloud? Where will there be the best protection? How can we develop systems that are going to give employees the greatest rights? How can we develop things that are going to help Europe thrive and survive and compete? What is the architecture that would allow citizens actually to be empowered? And how do we start bringing this incredible power of the cloud to the edge? What does that look like? What are the technical challenges with that? How do we move this amazing processing real-time power, distributed in a way where we get all of the same benefits, but we have this ability for each of us actually to participate in this market? And so this is some of our work. These are the things that we will turn up to work on Monday and ask ourselves, how do we bring standards into place? How do we start to look at ethics for AI? What are the security considerations that we need? How are we managing jurisdictions? What are we doing about open data? How do we manage this tension between when something looks like it's open and then immediately it's personally identified? And I think this is the work that each of us have right now. It's around how we look at data portability. It's how we look at the ability for us to geofence some information so it's contextual, so it delivers an amazing service real time, but once that service done, the data doesn't need to continue to exist. This is about privacy by design. This is around encryption. This is around data access. And so each of us now are at what I think is the forefront of a whole new capability. And I did a talk a few weeks ago in Australia where I was saying I think cloud architects are the new rock stars of the decade ahead. You know, this ability to be able to work out how to deliver an amazing system of productivity and at the same time build in this ability for it not just to be about privacy, but also for it to be about power. How do we start to harness the power of data? How do we start to bring each of us and our families into this shared economic open market. How do we do that in a way that creates opportunity? And going back to Jaron Lanier, and in closing, one of the things that he mentioned in the article that ran in the Financial Times last weekend was he believes that the enemy of the future is the complacent person. And if we each say that, look, this doesn't really affect me, this isn't really my cause, this isn't really my responsibility, I would challenge each of us, as I challenge myself every day, to say it's never too early, or one person can make a huge difference in saying, why don't we design that differently? Or why don't we explore this new type of technology? Or let's test this business model. Because if we don't start to do that, we will inherit the future of those that are motivated to create a future based on our complacency. And so if the enemy of the future is you and I and what we expect and what we want to see happen, then I would say that that future starts right now. Thank you.